the promise that changed my story forever. I couldn't help but whisper to the empty walls of my small apartment, "Is this all there is for me?" My voice trembled, barely louder than my racing heartbeat. Every door I had knocked on seemed to slam shut. Every hope I had nurtured felt like dust slipping through my fingers. I was tired, exhausted not just in body but in spirit. My name is Grace Bennett, and at that moment I felt like life itself had abandoned me. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and damp wood. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, echoing the storm that had been raging inside me for months. I sank onto the worn couch, hugging my knees, my thoughts swirling in a relentless loop. Why am I always the one left behind? I wondered. Why does it feel like everyone else is moving forward while I'm stuck here? Invisible, unworthy, forgotten. I glanced around at the chaos of my apartment. Piles of laundry, unopened letters, and half-packed boxes, remnants of plans I had made and dreams I had believed in. I had thought moving to this city would be a fresh start, a chance to build a life I could finally call my own. Instead, it had become a prison of disappointment. Every morning, I forced myself out of bed, went through the motions, smiled at strangers, nodded at coworkers, while inside, my heart quietly fractured a little more each day. I tried to pray. I whispered words I barely felt, words I had said 1,000 times before. God, am I failing? Am I doing something wrong? Do you even see me? The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I wanted to believe, but the emptiness was loud. Tears started to slip down my cheeks. Not the dramatic, loud kind you see in movies, but quiet, insidious tears that settled into the creases of my face, marking the weight of unspoken pain. I wanted someone, anyone, to see me, to reach out and tell me it would be okay. But no one came. I was utterly alone. And yet, in the depth of that loneliness, something began to stir, a whisper I almost didn't recognize. Don't give up. I didn't understand how, or why, or where it was coming from. I only knew I couldn't keep going like this. I needed something, someone, to remind me that life wasn't just this endless cycle of trying and failing, of hopping and being disappointed. I needed proof that there was more to my story, that the darkness wasn't permanent, that I wasn't meant to stay broken. I closed my eyes, my chest tight, my mind screaming with every what if I had ever carried. Could there really be a promise waiting for me? And in that quiet, almost imperceptible moment, I made a decision. I would search. I would find that promise, whatever it was, because if I didn't know how much longer I could keep whispering to walls that didn't answer. The apartment felt smaller the longer I stayed inside it. It wasn't just the physical space, it was the weight of all the almosts in my life. I thought moving to this city would be a fresh start, a chance to build the life I had dreamed about since I was a teenager. But the reality had been nothing like the vision I carried in my head. I had left my small hometown with excitement bubbling in my chest, certain I would find purpose and belonging here. I had packed my bag with more hope than clothes, convinced that opportunity was just around the corner. But months passed, and every job I applied for either went unanswered or slipped through my fingers. Projects I had poured myself into were dismissed, unseen. Each rejection left a little more emptiness in my chest. Each no, an invisible lock on the door I was trying to open. I tried to stay optimistic, repeating the phrases my mother had once told me. Grace, the world opens doors for those who knock. But what do you do when every knock feels ignored, when every effort feels like shouting into the void? I remember the first time I cried alone in my apartment. The sound startled me. It was raw, uncontrolled. I had tried to hold it together in front of coworkers, in front of acquaintances, even in front of the mirror. But alone, with nothing to hide behind, the tears came in waves. I felt like my dreams were ghosts, haunting a life I could no longer recognize. Weeks became months. Each day felt like I was walking in a fog, moving forward without direction, without light. I started questioning myself constantly. Am I not good enough? Am I too weak? Am I just failing at life? I stopped calling friends. I avoided social gatherings. Even my favorite coffee shop felt foreign, the barista's cheerful greetings piercing my chest instead of warming it. I had been taught that life is full of seasons, and this, I reasoned, must be a hard one. But it didn't feel like a season, it felt like the end. The silence in my apartment became almost tangible. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, pressing down on my chest. I would sit on the couch for hours, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, listening to the wind scrape against the windows. Every sound outside reminded me that life continued without me, that the world kept moving while I remained trapped in my small, lonely existence. One night I found myself on the floor, knees pressed to my chest, trembling. I had tried everything to escape the despair, exercise, reading, prayers that felt mechanical, even forcing myself to smile, but nothing worked. That night, it wasn't just sadness I felt. It was a creeping hopelessness that seeped into my bones. I thought about leaving everything behind, running away from the life I had built, from the expectations I couldn't meet. I imagined the world without my broken presence, and the idea, terrifying as it was, felt oddly peaceful. Then I remembered a verse from childhood, almost like a whisper from long ago. "For I know the plans I have for you," declares the Lord, "plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." I repeated it under my breath, though doubt clung to the words. I wanted to believe them, but it felt impossible. How could there be a plan for me when everything I touched seemed to fall apart? The next morning, I woke up with tears still staining my pillow, but something had shifted, just slightly. I felt a tiny spark inside me, fragile and hesitant. It was the whisper of a thought. Maybe there is more. Maybe I'm not meant to stay like this. I decided to take a small action, anything to reclaim a fragment of control over my life. I wrote down one goal, to step outside and walk, even if only to the corner store. The sun was pale but warm against my skin, and the city, bustling and noisy, felt a little less oppressive. I noticed a woman at a nearby cafe laughing with her child. Her laughter, unguarded and full, was like a splash of color against my gray morning. I realized I had forgotten how to notice beauty, how to feel small joys. For the first time in months, I whispered a real prayer, not because I expected an answer, but because I needed to feel connected to something greater than my despair. God, if you're there, show me. Don't let me be alone in this. That week, a friend I hadn't spoken to in months sent me a simple message. "Hey, I'm thinking about you. How are you?" It was short, casual, but it landed like a lifeline. I realized I had been isolating myself, letting loneliness grow unchecked. I hadn't realized how much the world's small connections could remind me I still mattered. I started taking tiny steps, writing down little things I was grateful for, reading verses that had always comforted me, listening to soft worship songs while cleaning the apartment. I didn't feel a miraculous change yet, but I felt lighter, a subtle shift, like the first faint rays of dawn cutting through a long, dark night. And in those quiet moments, I sensed it. There was a promise waiting for me, and somehow I was ready to find it. I was sitting on the park bench that afternoon, watching children chase pigeons, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from a group I had joined months ago, but had ignored, one meant for people seeking encouragement and hope. The text was simple: "Trust in the Lord, for his promises never fail." I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of skepticism and longing. Part of me scoffed. How could a few words change the years of disappointment I had carried? Yet another part, smaller, quieter, felt like it had been waiting for exactly that moment. I folded my hands over my knees, repeating the phrase aloud, feeling the syllables roll around in my mouth, almost tasting hope for the first time in months. I didn't understand how, but I felt a faint stirring inside me, a hint that maybe, just maybe, God was reaching out in ways I hadn't noticed. That night, I dug out an old notebook I had abandoned years ago. It had been meant for goals, dreams, and ideas, but the pages were mostly blank. I opened it carefully, almost reverently, as if it held something sacred. I started writing the verses that had always lingered in my memory, the ones my grandmother used to whisper to me as a child. Psalm 34, 17, Isaiah 40, 31, Matthew 19:26. Each word felt alive, and I didn't just write them. I prayed them, questioned them, whispered my pain into them. By the time I closed the notebook, I had filled 2 pages. I didn't feel fully healed, but for the first time in months, I felt seen. Not by people, not by circumstance, but by something bigger, by someone bigger. The next few days brought subtle shifts. I noticed them quietly at first, an encouraging word from a stranger, a minor opportunity at work, a sense of peace that didn't belong to me yet. I began to realize that God's presence didn't always arrive in dramatic miracles. Sometimes, it whispered through ordinary moments. One morning, as I walked to the corner store, I felt compelled to pause and read a passage I had memorized as a child. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. The words resonated differently now. They weren't abstract lessons. They were promises meant for me, here and now. For the first time in a long time, I dared to hope. I began incorporating small, intentional acts of faith into my daily life. I wrote down things I wanted to see change. I spoke affirmations aloud, and I made space for gratitude. I even started listening to worship songs while walking through the city streets, letting the lyrics sink into me. Great are you, Lord. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Gradually, I noticed a change, not instant, not magical, but a quiet resilience forming within me. The heaviness in my chest wasn't gone, but I could breathe again. The despair wasn't erased, but I could see past it. And for the first time, I started to feel that maybe my story wasn't over. One evening, as I sat on my couch with the journal of promises beside me, I felt a warmth spread through my chest. It was subtle, almost like sunlight on a winter morning, but unmistakable. I realized that my prayers were no longer desperate cries. They were conversations, and God was responding in ways I had been too blind to notice before. I wrote in my journal, I feel you, God. I don't fully understand, but I trust you. I believe there's more for me. And in that moment, I understood something profound. Hope isn't the absence of struggle, it's the presence of God in the midst of it. For the first time, I glimpsed the life I had imagined months ago, not free from difficulty, but filled with promise, guidance, and peace. Something inside me shifted that night. I knew I was no longer trapped in the despair that had consumed me for so long. I was beginning to rise. The days that followed were quieter, but not empty. I woke each morning with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in months. I realized that hope didn't appear in grand gestures. It appeared in consistency, in small steps of faith. I started my mornings by reading a verse and journaling a short prayer. Sometimes it was a single sentence, Lord, guide me today. Other times it was pages of thoughts, fears, and gratitude. I began to notice that the act of writing my prayers down made them feel more alive. It wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. Slowly, life started giving small signs that I was on the right path, an unexpected word of encouragement from a coworker, a stranger holding the door open with a smile, even a song on the radio that seemed to speak directly to my soul. I began to recognize these as God's ways of reminding me, I am with you, Grace. One evening, after weeks of journaling and prayer, I received a call about a project I had applied for months ago. I had almost stopped hopping. But the call came, offering me an opportunity I hadn't expected, a small but meaningful step toward the life I had dreamed of. I remember sitting on my couch, phone in hand, heart pounding. Tears ran down my cheeks, not from despair this time, but from relief and gratitude. I whispered, Thank you, Lord. I knew you hadn't forgotten me. It was a simple victory, but it mattered. For the first time, I truly felt that God was active in my life, working behind the scenes in ways I could not have orchestrated myself. With every small success, I felt courage building inside me. Courage not to ignore the pain of the past, but to face it with faith that the future held more than despair. I started to look forward to each day, not with unrealistic expectations, but with a quiet confidence that God's promises were real. One afternoon, walking through the city park, I remembered Psalm 37:4. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. I realized that my desires were not selfish. They were part of a plan. And delighting myself in God didn't mean ignoring life's struggles. It meant trusting that He could use even the hardships for good. I began to notice how God's presence was shaping me internally. I was more patient, more compassionate, and more attentive to the beauty around me. I started volunteering at a local community center, sharing my experiences with others who felt lost and overlooked. Helping them reminded me that my story, my journey, wasn't only about survival. It was about being part of a bigger purpose. Every evening, I would sit with my journal, reading the verses I had written. I realized that transformation wasn't just about opportunities, it was about perspective. I was beginning to see life through eyes of faith, rather than fear. One night, as I closed my journal, I felt a profound peace wash over me. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood that God's promises were trustworthy. My life was changing, not magically, but through steady, consistent steps of faith, reflection, and trust. I whispered Psalm 23:1 aloud. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The words felt alive, resonating in a way they never had before. I was not the same Grace who had whispered to empty walls just weeks ago. I had been transformed by trust, by hope, by the quiet but undeniable presence of God. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that my story was no longer defined by despair. It was being rewritten by a promise that never fails. I woke that morning with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The apartment no longer felt like a cage, it felt like home. The small victories I had once celebrated, the project call, the encouraging messages, the quiet moments of prayer, had compounded into something bigger, something undeniable. As I looked out the window, I realized that my life was not perfect, but it was full of purpose. Psalm 126:3 came to mind. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. I could see it in my circumstances, in the way I approached each day, in the renewed hope that pulsed quietly but firmly through my heart. The promise I had held on to, God's promise that He never forgets, never abandons, never fails, was alive. I had experienced it firsthand, not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing reality in my life. With my life beginning to shift, I felt compelled to reach out. I began sharing my story with others, friends, strangers, anyone who seemed lost in the weight of their own struggles. I spoke about the small steps, the whispered prayers, the verses that had become lifelines. It wasn't a perfect process. Some people didn't understand, some doubted, but others leaned in, clinging to my words like a lifeline of their own. I realized that my journey of restoration had a purpose beyond me. It was meant to inspire hope, to show that even the deepest darkness could give way to light. Days turned into weeks, and I noticed the changes ripple through every corner of my life. I was no longer paralyzed by fear or uncertainty. Opportunities continued to appear, not because life was suddenly easy, but because my faith and perspective had been renewed. I began journaling not just prayers, but victories, big and small. I wrote about mornings where I woke with hope, afternoons where I saw someone smile because of a kind word, evenings filled with peace that no chaos could disturb. My life had not only been restored, it had been transformed into something stronger, richer, and more vibrant than I could have imagined. Through it all, I remembered Jeremiah 29:11, For I know the plans I have for you, to give you hope and a future. I understood now that those words were alive, active, and intended for me all along. Sitting on my couch one evening, journal open and candle flickering beside me, I realized I had a story to share. A story of despair turned into hope, of silence replaced by God's voice, of emptiness transformed into purpose. I knew that what had happened to me wasn't unique. It could happen to anyone willing to hold on to the promises of God. I whispered a prayer, thanking Him for restoration, for faith renewed, for the courage to keep going when nothing made sense. And then I spoke aloud to the empty room, knowing someone somewhere would hear it through the words I shared. God's promises never fail. Hold on. Trust him. Your story can change too. The project I had been given turned into something bigger than I expected. My supervisor called me into her office one afternoon and said, "Grace, we've been impressed with your work. We'd like to offer you a permanent position." I stood there, speechless. Months ago, I couldn't even get a call back. Now, I was being offered stability, opportunity, and a chance to build the future I had almost given up on. I accepted with tears in my eyes, knowing this wasn't luck, it was grace. God's grace. That weekend, I sat in church for the first time in months. I had been avoiding it, feeling too broken to sit among people who seemed to have it all together. But that Sunday, I walked in with my head held high, not because I was perfect, but because I had been found. The worship leader sang a song about restoration, and the lyrics pierced my soul. You take what's broken, you make it beautiful again. I lifted my hands and wept openly, not caring who saw. This was my testimony. This was my song. After the service, a woman approached me. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. "I don't know you," she said, "but I felt God telling me to pray for you." She took my hand and prayed right there in the aisle. She prayed for continued healing, for doors to keep opening, for my story to touch others. When she finished, I hugged her tightly and whispered, "You have no idea how much I needed that." God was surrounding me with people who saw me, who prayed for me, who reminded me that I was never truly alone. The following week, I started a small blog. Nothing fancy, just a space where I could write about my journey, the pain, the doubts, the prayers, and the promises. I titled my first post, "The Promise That Changed My Story Forever." I poured my heart into every word, sharing the raw truth of where I had been and where God was taking me. I didn't expect anyone to read it. But within days, comments started pouring in. "Thank you for being honest. This is exactly what I needed to hear. I've been where you are, and your words gave me hope." I sat at my laptop, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the realization that my pain had purpose, that my story was becoming a bridge for others. I began writing more, weekly posts about faith, hope, resilience, and the small miracles that happen when we trust God's promises. My readership grew slowly but steadily. People from all over the world reached out, sharing their own struggles, asking for prayer, thanking me for being vulnerable. I realized that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was power. It was the power to connect, to heal, to inspire. One evening, I received an email from a young woman named Sarah. She told me she had been on the brink of giving up, that she had felt forgotten by God and everyone else. But she stumbled across my blog, read my story, and decided to hold on for one more day. Then another. Then another. "You saved my life," she wrote. "Thank you for sharing your story." I wept as I read her words. I hadn't saved her, God had. But he had used my story to reach her, and that was more humbling and beautiful than anything I could have imagined. I wrote back immediately, encouraging her, praying with her through email, reminding her that God's promises were for her too. That exchange reminded me why I had started sharing in the first place. It wasn't about me. It was about pointing others to the one who never fails. As the months passed, my life continued to transform. I was promoted at work. I reconnected with old friends. I joined a small group at church where I could be real and supported. But the most beautiful transformation was internal. I no longer woke up with dread. I no longer questioned my worth. I knew deep in my soul that I was loved, seen, and chosen by God, and that knowledge changed everything. One afternoon, I decided to go back to the park where I had first received that encouraging message months ago. I sat on the same bench, journal in hand, and reflected on how far I had come. The woman who had sat here months ago was broken, lost, hopeless. The woman sitting here now was whole, found, hopeful. I wrote in my journal, "God, you kept your promise. You didn't abandon me. You didn't give up on me. And now I'm living proof that your promises are real." As I sat there, a young woman approached and asked if she could sit beside me. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying. Without hesitation, I said, "Of course." We sat in silence for a moment. Then she whispered, "I don't know why I came here today. I needed to get away." I turned to her and said gently, "I've been where you are, and I want you to know there's hope. God sees you. He hasn't forgotten you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. I needed to hear that. We talked for over an hour. I shared pieces of my story, and she shared hers. Before she left, I gave her my phone number and told her to reach out anytime she needed encouragement. As I watched her walk away, I felt God's presence so strongly. He had brought me full circle, from the broken woman on the bench to the woman offering hope to someone else. That night, I wrote another blog post titled, "When God Uses Your Pain to Heal Someone Else." I shared the story of meeting the young woman in the park, and how God had positioned me to be exactly where she needed someone to be. The responses flooded in. People shared their own stories of being on both sides, receiving hope when they needed it most, and then being able to give it to someone else. I realized that this was the beauty of God's promises. They don't just change us, they equip us to change others. My blog continued to grow, and I was invited to speak at a women's conference. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I felt both terrified and honored. I shared my story, all of it, the darkness, the doubt, the despair, and then the promise, the hope, the transformation. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. But more than that, I saw women wiping tears, nodding their heads, standing to their feet. After the talk, dozens of women came up to me, sharing their own struggles, thanking me for being real, asking how they could hold on to hope when everything felt hopeless. I hugged each one and said the same thing: trust God's promises, He will not fail you. That night, lying in my hotel room, I whispered, "God, you've done more than I ever imagined. Thank you for turning my pain into purpose." The months that followed were filled with continued growth, personally, professionally, spiritually, but I never forgot where I came from. I kept writing, kept speaking, kept sharing, because I knew there were still people sitting on park benches, whispering to empty walls, wondering if anyone saw them. And I wanted them to know, God sees you, He hears you, and His promises never fail. 1 year after that desperate night in my apartment, I returned to that same spot. I sat on the couch, looked around at the space that once felt like a prison, and marveled at how different everything was. The apartment was the same, but I was not. I opened my journal and read the entry I had written that night. "Is this all there is for me?" And then I wrote beneath it, "No, there was so much more, and God knew it all along." I thought about everything that had happened, the small steps, the whispered prayers, the verses that became lifelines, the opportunities that opened, the people I had met, the lives that had been touched. All of it traced back to one thing: God's promise. The promise that He would never leave me, never forsake me, never forget me. And He kept that promise. I began planning my next steps. I wanted to write a book, to reach even more people with the message that God's promises are alive and active. I wanted to start a podcast, to have deeper conversations about faith, struggle, and hope. But more than anything, I wanted to keep living as a testimony, a living, breathing reminder that no matter how dark the night, the promise of dawn is real. That evening, I posted one final blog entry for the year. I titled it, "The Promise That Changed My Story Forever." In it, I shared everything: the full journey, the highs and lows, the moments of doubt and the moments of clarity. And I ended with this: if you're reading this and you're in the darkness right now, hold on. God's promises are not just words on a page, they are living, active, and meant for you. Trust Him. He will not fail you. Your story can change too. The comments poured in immediately. Hundreds of people sharing their own stories, their own struggles, their own testimonies of how God had kept His promises. I sat at my laptop, overwhelmed with gratitude. My story wasn't just mine anymore, it was a part of something bigger, something eternal. I closed my laptop, picked up my journal, and wrote one final entry for the night. God, thank you. Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for changing my story. And thank you for allowing me to be part of changing others' stories too. I invite anyone reading this to share your own story in the comments. Preach hope, share redemption, and let others know that miracles are not just stories, they are happening today. And if this testimony touched your heart, subscribe to join me in celebrating the endless work of God in the lives of those who refuse to give up. Because even in the darkest moments, even when walls seem unyielding, God's promises are alive, and He can change your story forever.